Man, the living creature, the creating individual, is always more important than any established style or system. Bruce Lee. You're listening to Socratic Smarts.
Here is the point. Here is the point. Here is the point.
Chop the volume, we go down on the other side, pick up the next one. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight and whether this is quite authentic.
Welcome back, listener, to Socratic Smarts. I'm Nomadic J, as always, and it's a pleasure to have you back here to entertain your ears for the next 30 minutes or so. You know, it's always a privilege because, of course, there are many podcasts out there. I appreciate it. If you want to give me some feedback on the show, I assume you like it to some degree, and you want to be a part of its creation process and just give some feedback on what you'd like to see in the future, what philosophical texts you might be interested in, please email me at socraticsmarts@gmail.com. But today we're talking about religion, and that is not a sensitive topic at all, is it? So it's going to be an interesting one. You know, I'll just give you the background of how this episode came about. I should say at the top, we'll talk about some Athenian contexts for viewing religion, you know, how their society was seeing gods and how it was passed down to them from previous ancient Greek societies. And we'll also look at the Euthyphro, the Socratic dilemma that is presented to a character in the dialogue, and that'll be interesting. It's the idea that, you know, God is either perfect and he creates what is good or bad, or, you know, something is just good or bad in and of itself. Is killing wrong because we say it's wrong, or is killing wrong because God says it's wrong? It seems like you can't split that difference. You can't have it both ways, listener. But before we get there, I want to give you the background here. So I was watching the JRE, the Joe Rogan Experience, of course, the explosively popular podcast, much more popular than this humble show. He had Brian Greene on the episode. Brian Greene is a physicist. If you don't know who he is, what are you doing? Get your life, listener, get your life together. He is an amazing romantic communicator of science. It's a great episode. Check it out. But basically, it was interesting because we got to see a scientist talk about religion, and a physicist for that matter, someone who is the most reductive, physicalist person you could really have in a room. And even though he sees the world primarily in mathematics, and he said he was doing mathematics by the time he was 5, he was doing complex equations by then, he even admitted that religion, to some degree, has some positive aspects to it. And with the obvious caveat that religion does a lot of harm in the global world. Wherever you look, even if it's in history or the modern day, there are still many examples of the ways in which religious fundamentalism and religious tyranny and theocracy really does cause a lot of suffering for many people. But for these next few minutes, listener, let's put the fun back in religious fundamentalism. I mean, let's take it seriously for a moment. Why would there still be religion today if it didn't have some fitness benefit, if it didn't really give some people a fitness advantage over others in navigating their environment? I mean, if we took this proposition seriously, that the only reason people are religious or that religion exists is because they're just dumb. You know, if we took the Nietzschean point of view that God is dead and we ought to fear this idea because the flock herd of sheep need their religion, otherwise they're going to go crazy, right? They're just going to abandon all morality and start killing each other. That seems almost comical. It seems like many of us know competent religious people who have integrated the ideas into their lives, maybe in a metaphorical sense, maybe not in a literal way, but they've done it to some degree where it's kind of like storytelling. It's kind of like viewing your life maybe from a different vantage where you get to see the whole picture. Maybe the idea that you have a beginning and a middle and an end. It's okay if you're struggling at the beginning because, you know, there's more to learn. There's a journey to walk is a interesting concept. But so we don't get too political with respect to our religious discussion, and so we can try to aspire to stay philosophically motivated as possible, we'll look at the Athenian gods, the pantheism of gods. And also, I think it's just more interesting, don't you think? The idea that, our Abrahamic religions that we see today in the Western world, the idea that God is just one dude or one gal, I don't know. It's really strange, isn't it? Because many cultures have a different perspective where they see gods as the embodiment of human emotions and thoughts. And so because of this, every god has a unique feature, the goddess of love and the god of war and the god of thunder, the god of the seas, all these different tumultuous gods, all these crazy and inspiring gods and demigods for that matter, and all these different stories. How can we best understand them so that we aren't confused by the actual literal nature of some of these dialogues, that we understand that some people take this stuff literally, but all the while try to actually look at what's useful? And that is the motivation for that Bruce Lee quote at the beginning. You really have to be an individual in this respect and not be too sucked in by the cultish aspect of religious belief. And so you can have a, you might say spiritual, metaphysical belief about your life, and also have that coupled with the idea that science is our best tool for understanding the nature of the physical world. There's no contradiction here. Even if you think everything happens for a reason, as a motivation to, you might say, overcome adversity or to try new things, just a way to get over the initial anxiety and fear that we all feel from trying out some novel, unfamiliar experience, and say, well, there might be a reason for why I have to do this or step over this bridge or do whatever I have to do to climb this mountain. I'm going to be a better person because of it, whatever. And, there's a lot of truth to the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. These are metaphorical ideas that are embedded in many religious traditions that we ought to take seriously. As you might say, I definitely identify as a kind of agnostic person, but I don't have the cynical attitude that a lot of atheists that I tend to see have, where they want to kind of extinguish it from the world. I want to extinguish all of the antisocial and oppressive aspects of the dogmas, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that we can't somehow balance the idea of metaphor and story and real transcendence, and also still say that Isaac Newton is right and Galileo had a point and Spinoza shouldn't have been excommunicated because he provided the basis for much of our knowledge. We can balance all of these things, and I think we can only do this when we take the individual moral perspective seriously. And so with that in mind, let's explore the mental territory of religious fundamentalism and put the fun back in some of these ideas that relate to being transcendent, really getting outside of yourself and approaching the world from a different vantage of always being stuck in your head, always thinking that, well, Earth is just a rock floating through space, so to hell with it all, if that is what you're thinking. And so, with that said, listener, we'll see you in the next segment of the show. You're listening to Socratic Smarts. Welcome back, listener, to Socratic Smarts. Let's get straight into it, shall we? This is going to be the Athenian context for understanding religious belief, understanding religion in that time and historical context. But before we get there, we have to do a little bit of groundwork. Here is Carlos Gómez, the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece. Quote, "The stories of the Greek gods form a rich mythology, beautifully narrated in the poems of Homer and Hesiod. No other civilization cultivated the narrative power, depth, and richness of its myths to the extent that the Greeks did, and the visual and literary works that were born from and helped create them still impact on Western cultural production. The Greeks mined their ancient stories for answers to the big questions that people have been asking since time immemorial. Conscious of the power of the unknown, they used their myths to explain the origins of their world, grant order to nature, and give meaning to their existence. It is impossible to trace the roots of the Greek mythological tradition. The first manifestations that can be firmly dated and located appear in the poems of Homer, written in the 7th century BC. With the caveat that there is still some uncertainty over whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by one individual. Fewer doubts attached to Hesiod's authorship. Although it is now agreed that the Theogony now includes some passages written and added by later authors. It is the works of these poets that the ancient stories which until then had been handed down and shared by word of mouth, the word mythos in its plainest sense, meaning simply narrative, report, or story, were fixed in writing. According to Hesiod, the cosmos, the universe, the word originally signified order, was created from a shapeless mass the Greeks called chaos. Next came Gaia, the earth, and Tartarus, the abyss, followed by Uros. Gaia gave birth to Uranos, the sky, as well as the mountains and the sea, and many other first-generation gods that represented the forces of nature that did not take human form." End quote. We also should get a taste here for the Olympic Pantheon. This is the emergence of the genealogy of gods that comes out of Homer and Hesiod. And this is all the characters, right, that you're familiar with. You know, we've got Ares, Aphrodite, Zeus, Hera. We have all these different characters that had moral aspects to them. And this made them quite interesting, not just as religious figures who had godly powers, but actually as representing certain beliefs and certain behaviors. It's almost a psychology going on here. And we'll get a taste for, how about the one in which Athens is named after in the first place, the goddess Athena. Quote, "She was the virgin goddess of wisdom and the tactics of war, the protector and patron of Athens and other cities. She was the daughter of Zeus and the Titaness Metis. After impregnating Metis, Zeus swallowed her, feeling that their child would overthrow him. Ultimately, Athena emerged, armed and fully grown from Zeus's head. She was unconquerable. Not even Ares, the god of war, can defeat her in battle. Athena is symbolized by the owl and the olive tree. And then we have, of course, Big Papa of them all, the Mac Daddy Zeus. Quote, God of Indo-European origin, his name derives from a word meaning celestial brightness. After dethroning his father, Kronos, Zeus became the king of the gods and imposed a new cosmic order based on the ideal of justice. Homer calls him the father of gods and men. This is not meant literally, though Zeus did father many illegitimate children with mortal women, but signifies that, like the human Basilius that Homer depicts, he leads the clan." End quote. So that is the situation going on in Athens when we zoom in. And you got to understand that there are so many amazing stories here. Like, I'm summarizing not much at all. You know, as Gómez alluded to there, a lot of our modern stories that we continue to tell are based on the writings of Homer and Hesiod, and the emergence of these massive superhero movies, you might say, is actually kind of, you know, the public appreciation for gods fighting amongst each other. And it's a strange thing that's happened recently where we have the technology to almost portray the battles of these Greek myths. And now Zeus is Captain America, and you've got Iron Man, and you've got all these, you know, superheroes. But really, this was something very similar to what the Greeks were up to in their stories where there were good guys, there were bad guys, and there was a lot of moral depth to how they thought about religion in this way. And it's ought to be noted here as well that that is why I think those movies are so popular, don't you think, listener? Because they really touch something deep in us, and they know that that story, that heroic journey, really maps on to something deep in us that even the Greeks were aware of at this time, with respect to their admiration for these tales, these stories, which they passed down through word of mouth for many generations, and only came into writing when the technology was available, when the thought occurred to someone, to Homer, to write this shit down into a poem and get this out there to the masses. Once communication became more fundamental to the society, that only then are we aware of what's going on. You might astutely ask at this point, what came before Zeus and the Olympic Pantheon, and also the writings of Homer and Hesiod? I can't aspire to give a full summary of everything there, but let's go to J.W. Roberts in City of Socrates. Quote, "Behind Zeus, the Sky Father, and his eagle lay the Indo-European rainmaker or bird shaman of Siberia, first visible in a Lascaux cave painting. A shaman is a kind of magician or sorcerer who, after being quote-unquote called, going into retreat and acquiring a technique of ecstasy, is supposedly able to go at will on psychic trips, perhaps up to heaven or down to the underworld. To induce his ecstasy, the shaman is supposed to summon and take possession of familiar or helping spirits, especially the souls of dead shamans, who enable him to acquire information or perform feats beyond natural human scope. There is no clear line marking the end of magic and the beginning of religion, but whenever procedures intended to rouse nameless powers began to give way to procedures intended to placate and please named and personal gods, the transition from magic to religion is being made. At this very early stage, the world was small, and no one had the leisure to consider whether it had a beginning in time or had an end in space. The questions raised were practical ones of survival rather than metaphysical. The shaman provided, or appeared to provide, the mastery necessary for survival. A shaman with a magnetic personality and a long record of success would be remembered after his death and would appear in the dreams of the living, would be credited with their subsequent successes to the chase, and would begin to loom larger and larger in their thinking, as increasingly tall stories were told of his exploits." End quote. To ask a question like what comes before religion, or what comes before specifically in this case, the Greek religion, the ancient Greek and the archaic Greek myths, what comes before that? We're really talking about something equivalent to magic. Religion begins when we start to anthropomorphize our conception of the universe as a sort of being where we're in relationship to it. Esoteric way, I guess you could say. I don't know, it's a hard difference to split, listener. I'm with you there if you think that's a difficult line to draw. And with that, the establishment of religion begins when one writes something down and starts to pass it on from generation to generation and start to establish dogmas and doctrines and behavior rites and traditions and rituals related to this idea that if we do X, the universe will do Y, and we can sort of have a reciprocal relationship with nature itself. Let's go back to Roberts as he describes how this started to become established. Quote, "One stage in the development of the Greek gods that is supremely and even dangerously well documented is the Hesiodic and Homeric. The theogony of the Boeotian poet Hesiod is the earliest surviving attempt to impose order and definition on the shifting chaos of early Greek religious beliefs. It was Hesiod and Homer who gave the Greeks a theogony, genealogy of the gods, gave the gods their titles, assigned them their statuses and skills, and gave an indication of their appearance. Hesiod finds room in his pantheon for a wide diversity of divinities, the individual and personal gods of current cult, like Zeus and Athena, their half-forgotten predecessors, groups like the Fate and the Muses, features of the visible world, like heaven and earth, sun and moon, personal abstractions, as we should say, such as persuasion, strife, victory, sleep, and death. The Greek tendency to describe in personal terms what we regard as things was very strong. How far it reflected a difference in perception as opposed to a linguistic tradition is hard to say. These gods are beautiful, and, like their possessions, ageless and deathless. Though not even Zeus is omnipotent, they have much more power and therefore honour than men. What they do easily and without risk. Indeed, the whole of life of the gods is easy. For them, the spectacle of human life is entertainment, gripping at times, and even painful, if their own offspring are in trouble, but not ultimately serious. The Christian reader of the Iliad is struck not only by the humanity of Homer's Olympian gods, but also by their inhumanity. End quote. So it is for good or ill, listener, whether you take that as a good or bad thing, that the gods are kind of these dramatic characters. You might think that encourages people to maybe not take their lives seriously and sort of justify their own outrage and passion when in moments where they maybe should be more servile, because maybe one major contrast between the religious structures in place today is that they mainly encourage that civility as opposed to seeing the gods as anthropomorphic, humanized figures in some way. You know, the God of Abraham has nothing to do with being a human. He is beyond time, beyond space. He is perfection, omnipotent, omniscient, and we are supposed to be absolutely servile in respect to that omnipotence, because human beings don't have anything close to this kind of knowledge. But, you know, even though this reverence still existed in the days of Athens, certainly the common folk had much reverence for the gods of Zeus, and obviously temples were the place of sacrifices for many different gods, and blood sacrifices, many dark elements to this religious obsession as well, of course. But they also were able to see the gods as inspiring because of this human aspect to them. So religion was also, it had this flip side to it where we could argue about the justice of something, or the goodness of something, or the love of something being important to our debate. You know, heroism was very much a stronger idea in their religious discussion than it is within ours, with respect to describing the gods as being like us and capable of being somewhat sharing our emotions in some way. Not to say that the gods are similar to us, because they're not. They're supreme beings on Mount Olympus, and so they're certainly much better than our feeble human minds could ever comprehend. But because they share the element of rage or the element of passion for life, we can empathize and feel like we're connected to something bigger than simply just our society. We can see the universe as being a manifestation of what we are, which is this chaotic energy of emotion and thought that we're trying to construct into order and construct a life that actually makes sense and one that is worth living. And in this respect, religion was serving that function to some better or worse degree. To get a deeper sense of what they really believed, Roberts is going to outline some of the principles here. He goes on to say, quote, Athenian society was diverse, and there was no uniformity of belief or practice, but most Athenians believed more or less wholeheartedly in the existence of personal gods of mythology, both Olympian and chthonic underworld, the potency of divine images, the appropriateness of prayers, sacrifices, dedications, festivals, the possibility of divination, the importance of each man's daimon for his own life, the danger of pollution and the efficacy of purification. And he goes on to say a few more, but we'll just stop there because it's important to clarify. By pollution and purification, things like killing a man pollutes you. There's a real physical thing that happened to someone. And if you were around a person that committed a homicide or a murder, that is what is meant by pollution and purification, getting rid of the bad energy around that evil malice that has been shown to exist. Let's also get an idea before we move on to the final segment where we're going to look at the Euthyphro dialogue. What was on Socrates' mind with respect to the religious dogmas of his day? Let's have a look. Quote, according to Xenophon, as we have seen, Socrates believed in consulting Delphi on practical questions that were beyond the scope of any techne. Although the god might riddle, he could not lie. He believed also that some dreams were veridical. Again, like other men, he recognized the divinity of the sun and moon. Their behavior was too highly predictable for Athenians to credit them with much personality. But belief in the all-seeing eye and the all-hearing ear of Helios was not dead, and Nicias' troops at Syracuse certainly revered the moon. All these three beliefs are attributed to Socrates in Plato's Apology, which is unlikely to have departed very far in substance from what some hundreds of men have heard Socrates say not many years earlier. Finally, according to Xenophon, Socrates accepted an ancestor of the argument from design, which seeks to establish the existence of a designer from the evidence of design in the world about us. End quote. And so, who knows, listener, how much of this is due to the ignorance that any human being is doomed by virtue of being born in their historical time period. You know, how much do we not know about what we don't know right now, for instance? If you can even imagine what you can't imagine, that is the hard problem. And what if we had Socrates and explained to him Darwinian evolution, and told him how we can have a designed form of life without necessarily having a design, and maybe he changes his mind on that last point. But you might also imagine if Socrates really did believe that there was a designer, that there was some, if not gods of his time, if Zeus wasn't real, there was some being out there or some prenatal universe, some prenatal form that created us. Because how else do you explain the complexity of who we are and what we are and the mysteries of the natural world? Then don't you think it could have given him some purpose in his life, some drive perhaps? Even if he didn't really believe it, maybe that gave him the strength, you might say, the courage to walk into the Athenian courtroom and stare down his jurors and say, well, look, I'm not going to grovel. I'm not going to just say I was wrong when I don't think I'm wrong. I have this inner voice. I believe I have this connection to some being, some consciousness, and I'm going to rely on that as opposed to just what you're telling me to do, which is to basically admit to something I don't think I've done, because all I've done is make you wiser, more gentle, smarter beings. And in this respect, I think it's important to point out, because I always bring this up every episode, if we want to cover one aspect, if you remember anything about the Socratic philosophy from this show, it's the idea that ignorance is the fundamental thing. It's the evil that is the evil of all evils. And I think Socrates used ignorance to not become a full, you might say, skeptic atheist, right? He's not gonna reject religion. He's not saying it's not true, and that's why he said the charge of atheism in the Apology was an absurd one, because he does have these metaphysical beliefs, these religious beliefs about how his existence came into being. They just don't necessarily match up with the thing that everyone else agrees on and is repeating to one another in the temples and in the stories. It's just very fascinating, I think, from my perspective anyway, as someone who didn't really have any religious upbringing, to come at this problem from the non-belief perspective and actually really acknowledge how much power these transcendent ideas can have if you take them maybe metaphorically in line and allow them to really enhance your connection to life, but then all the while being aware that there is a way of losing the tether of logic, I suppose. I guess that's a fear I certainly have, or maybe allowing reason to suspend itself so much that you don't have a coherent empirical sense of what the world really is. I don't know. Maybe figure that out for yourself. It's just a strange problem to have, I guess, the tension there, because we do live in a world that claims to have human beings who believe the earth is flat, and that isn't that just a mystery in general? Who knows? Anyway, get into the Euthyphro dialogue, where we talk about the morality of a god in the religious context in the next segment. Stay tuned.
This little organism on this little planet is what the whole show is growing there, and so realizing its own presence. Well, now here's the problem. If this is the state of affairs, which is so, and if the consciousness state you're in at this moment is the same thing as what we might call the divine state, if you do anything to make it different, it shows you don't understand that it's so. Being ridiculous harder and more assiduously than usual.
Nature doesn't give a damn. Nature doesn't give a damn. And we put ourselves down, see?
Welcome back, listeners, to Socratic Smarts. In the final segment of the show, we're looking at the Euthyphro dialogue, which is named after the character that Socrates is talking to. It's just another one of these one-on-one discussions. It's one of the shorter ones as well, and we're not going to go very deep into all of the intricacies of everything being said, but the central question of the dialogue that has been debated in philosophy for quite some time now, particularly in the philosophy of religion, is a nice little question to tie everything together. So we'll get to that at the very end. But first, let's dive into the Euthyphro, shall we? The context here, we're outside of the courtroom, and this is pre-apology, and so Socrates has been charged with impiety and atheism, denying the gods, making the worst argument the stronger by Miletus, and he is awaiting his opportunity to defend himself to his fellow Athenian people. So the apology speech hasn't happened yet. This is just before that. And Socrates runs into someone he knows, Euthyphro, and Euthyphro claims to know something about piety, something about what it means to correctly worship the gods and do so in a way which provides a moral basis to do things. And so Euthyphro wants to say that he really does understand what piety is, because he thinks what he's doing, and he is charging his father with murder, is the pious thing to do. And Socrates is a little puzzled by this, even though he does trust that Euthyphro might know. He thinks, well, maybe there's an argument that to put your father in prison, maybe you could make the case that that would be the impious thing to do in this respect. But let's go into an excerpt here. We start with our friend Socrates. Quote, "I should not be surprised, but you will tell me these at leisure some other time. For now, try to tell me more clearly what I was asking just now, my friend. You did not teach me adequately when I asked you what the pious was, but you told me that what you are doing now in prosecuting your father for murder is pious." Euthyphro, "And I told the truth, Socrates." Socrates, "Perhaps you agree, however, that there are many other pious actions." "There are." "Bear in mind, then, that I did not bid you tell me one or two of the many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all other pious actions pious. For you agreed that all impious actions are impious, and all pious actions pious through one form, or don't you remember?" "I do." "Tell me, then, what this form itself is, so that I may look upon it and use it as a model. Say that any action of yours or another's that is of a kind that is pious, and if it is not, that it is not." "If that is how you want it, Socrates, that is how I will tell you." "That is what I want." "Well then, what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious." Splendid, Euthyphro. You have now answered in the way I wanted. Whether your answer is true, I don't know yet, but you will obviously show me that what you say is true. Certainly. Come then, let us examine what we mean. An action or man dear to the gods is pious, but an action or man hated by the gods is impious. They are not the same, but quite opposite, the pious and the impious. Is that not so? It is indeed. And that seems to be a good statement. I think so, Socrates. We have also stated that the gods are in a state of discord. They are at odds with one another, Euthyphro, and that they are with enmity with each other. Has that too been said? It has. What are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Let's look at it this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers as to which is the greater, would this difference make us enemies and angry at each other? Or would we proceed to count and soon resolve our difference about this? We would certainly do so. Again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would turn to measurement and soon cease to differ. That is so. And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and to be reconciled. What subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine, as I tell you, whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not subjects of difference about which, when we are unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other whenever we do? That is the difference, Socrates, about these subjects. What about the gods, Euthyphro? If indeed they have differences, will it not be about these same subjects? It certainly must be so. Then, according to your argument, my good Euthyphro, different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good, and bad, for they would not all be at odds with one another unless they differed about these subjects, would they? You are right. And they like what each of them considers beautiful, good, and just, and hate the opposite of these. Certainly. But you say that the same things are considered just by some gods and unjust by others, and as they dispute about these things, they are at odds and at war with each other. Is that not so? It is. The same things that are loved by the gods and hated by the gods, and would be both God-loved and God-hated. It seems likely. And the same things would be both pious and impious according to this argument. I'm afraid so. So you did not answer my question, you surprising man. I did not ask you what same thing is both pious and impious, and it appears that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them. So it is in no way surprising if your present action, namely punishing your father, may be pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Kronos and Uranus, pleasing to Hephaestus, but displeasing to Hera, and so with any other gods who differ from each other on this subject. End quote. That excerpt there demonstrates how Socrates uses the arguments of many gods having different views on different moral subjects. You know, he uses the example of Zeus there. Zeus would approve of Euthyphro's decision to prosecute his father because, of course, Zeus killed his father, Kronos. But if you took the opinion of Kronos or Uranus, who were usurped by their sons, perhaps they would have a different view on whether that is a pious thing to do, to take down your father just because you perceive them as being morally wrong. They would have a different view on that. And Socrates is simply pointing out here that, Euthyphro, if you think you know what is pious, well, if you think you know what the gods like, and you have this deeper connection to them than all other Athenians, it seems to be the case that not even you could say what all the gods like. And if you say that piety is something that pleases not just one god, but all the gods, well, it seems that this is in contradiction because all the gods disagree about certain things. We can't find any coherent view across all the gods that they all morally sign off on and have this sort of consistency that Socrates wants. He wants this self-defining and consistent definition of what piety is. What does it mean to worship the gods in the correct way, in the right way, such that we get favor put on us in the future? That is the primary reason to demonstrate piety towards the gods. And we have one more excerpt here we're going to look at, which highlights the fundamental dilemma here in the dialogue. So we'll go back to Socrates' quote. But if the god loved and the Pierce were the same, my dear Euthyphro, then the Pierce would be loved because it was Pierce. The god loved would also be being loved because it is God loved. And if the god loved was God loved because it was being loved by the gods, then the Pierce would also be Pierce because it was loved by the gods. But now you see they are in opposite cases as being altogether different from each other. The one is such as to be loved because it is being loved. The other is being loved because it is such as to be loved. I'm afraid, Euthyphro, that when you asked what piety is, you did not wish to make its nature clear to me, but you told me an effect or quality of it, that Pierce has the quality of being loved by all the gods. But you have not told me what the Pierce is. Now, if you will, do not hide things from me, but tell me again, from the beginning, what piety is. Whether being loved by the gods or having some other quality, we shall not quarrel about that, but be keen to tell me what the pious and the impious are." End quote. The central tension here comes from whether something is moral or good just because it is in and of itself, so something like justice, or is just as good because it's the virtue that Zeus has. So this tension here exists in any person willing to look at their religious text or doctrine with a little more depth and say, well, is love good because God says it's so, or is love good because it makes me feel good? It makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and it makes people around me feel warm and fuzzy. Or on the flip side, is killing wrong just because God says it's wrong, or is it wrong because of the actual suffering it causes, because of the real psychological harm that it socially inflicts on other people, because of the pollution it causes within our society? It's hard to split this difference, but this is what's referred to, if you want to look this up, the Euthyphro dilemma, and it's one of these central philosophical questions that still goes without, in my opinion, a really good answer. I mean, one response to this from the religious perspective is to say that God is love, so you can sort of split the difference there and say, well, God just is justice, God just is the good, and there is no difference there. You're just not seeing clearly that perfection, that justice is God in and of itself. But then it seems like we lose the anthropomorphic perception of God, whether God is a man sitting on a cloud, or whether gods are on Mount Olympus with different emotions and different characters, playing out different scenes in a drama. Whatever it may be, if we say that God is just the emotions or just the perfection of our virtues, and there is no difference there, he is synonymous with justice and love and all of those things, then we lose the deity, the actual person that we're supposed to be seeing as a god. And maybe that solves the dilemma there for you, listener, but I don't know, I'm not completely satisfied by that question. If you do have some feedback on that dilemma there that you want to contribute to the show, I'd be happy to hear that feedback, so please hit me up at socraticsmarts@gmail.com. And as far as today's episode's gone, that'll just about do it. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've covered how the Athenians saw religion and how they used it to not only have a servile aspect to their lives, but also to inspire things like justice and goodness, and having the ability to really see the gods as a sort of drama, a play of human emotion and psychology that allowed for maybe a greater depth of living, you might say, to some degree. And we're ending on this question of how do we know, if we are religious and if we do want to approach religious texts with a spiritual depth, you might say, well, we're not just taking everything literally, where we're trying to put the text in its historical context and try to understand what were the practical shamanic lessons that were being delivered at the time, and why did they write this down? Why has this document survived through thousands of years of evolution and changes in societies? And you might just say it's just coincidence, but if you want to take a different approach and say, well, there's a reason, there's a reason by virtue of the fitness of these beliefs that it helps one navigate their social environment, but also their psychological environment, such that we can learn some things some of the time from these religious texts. But I would be remiss if I didn't say at the end here that we also need to be very much on guard, listener, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a cultish aspect to religious belief that we always need to be mindful of. And I would always just advise that we never lose our tether to empirical knowledge, and that we always defer to the actual scientists at the end of the day when we're talking about the nature of the physical world, and that we have a very clear difference in what we consider to be empirically useful knowledge and empirical truths about the world versus metaphorical psychological truths about the human mind, which may or may not be useful for one person depending on their behavioral disposition or their genetic makeup or their personality, whatever it may be. Some metaphors work better than others, and insofar as people need a religious scaffolding to explore these ideas of morality and existential significance, then we ought to find a way to integrate that, I think, in a healthy way, as opposed to taking the atheist perspective where we just dismiss everything entirely, or the opposite route where we take the fully cultish perspective where we adopt everything without any critical thinking. There certainly has to be a balance here that one needs to work out for themselves, and so I leave you again with the individualist perspective. Take the Bruce Lee perspective, integrate what works, discard the rest. And with that, listener, this has been Socratic Smarts. We'll see you next time.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
Chop the volume, we go. Put it down on the other side. Pick up the next one. And this is the annual reading of the scriptures.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight and whether this is quite authentic.